this battlefield situation in Ukraine, it's important. I'm not a military person, though. I didn't serve in the military. I didn't do any training. Uh, it's not my specialty. Politics are my specialty. Geopolitics, diplomacy, economics, the struggle over these key elements of this conflict are my specialty. And it's not just this conflict, but worldwide. And I like to pay close attention to this because if war is politics with bloodshed, then a lot of people say that politics is war without bloodshed. But this is often underplayed, and I say this a lot, that the politics of this conflict are often downplayed. And that's because, well, it is a pretty fiery conflict on the ground. There's a lot of fighting going on. That is very attractive, right? This is the collective West and the United States happen to be entities built on war, right? Built on military warfare and some of the most brutal, vile, and just absolutely egregious kinds of aggressive acts of war. And whenever you see a country like Russia standing up to that, right, and calling the United States on its bluff and saying, oh, you're going to wage a proxy war? Well, we will defend ourselves. Well, I'm not surprised that people are excited to follow that and to understand that better, especially the battlefield situation. But I want to talk about here, after Bakhmut fell, one key element to this not being talked about, and that's the diplomatic fallout, the political fallout. Because you hear all kinds of different messages, right? It gets more and more confusing by the week, it seems. Sometimes it feels like the United States and the collective West can't help but just glow. It's like they're pregnant with possibility in Ukraine. They think they have it all, that they're ready to win, that defeat of Russia is on the horizon. You hear it. Well, Ukraine's going to take back the territory, counteroffensive, Crimea, all of it, and we're going to support it. You hear the confidence. They'll say it confidently, and then the next day they'll say, no, wait, we don't actually support that. Well, let's wait and see what happens in this counteroffensive. How many times have we heard that? It's absolutely, it boggles the mind. It's really difficult to follow sometimes because there is this kind of psychic contradiction happening in the minds of the neocons. They are trying to spin the narrative, and I think they're spinning themselves dizzy. And the reason why I think that is because when they are on the precipice of defeat, that's when the panic sets in. So there is panic. And so Ukraine's NATO membership has been debated, not even debated really, because since 2008, the United States has been like, oh yeah, Ukraine's going to be in NATO eventually. But there's been a lot of talks about, well, how quickly? Well, there's a lot of these anti-Russian hawks, right? Anti-Russia forces, these neocons, these NAFO trolls, all of them. They're like, oh, Ukraine should have been in NATO already, right? If Ukraine was in NATO, then everything would be fine. And it's almost taken as this act of diplomacy that was missed, right? But of course, there's nothing diplomatic about NATO. NATO is a military force. It's an entity of empire. It is one that enforces a neocon foreign policy agenda. It is a imperial apparatus that has killed millions upon millions of people in many different places, whether it's the blood on NATO's hands in Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, in Yugoslavia. We can go on and on and on. NATO has a lot of blood on its hands. Iraq, it had forces in Iraq. I mean, we can just name names. NATO has been around since the end of, since 1947. But I want to show you now the latest about this NATO conversation. And so this is Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor. And oftentimes you'll see the collective West say, oh yeah, Ukraine will be in NATO. Don't you worry. But they'll always say not yet. And here is Mr. Scholz, who is a puppet of the United States by all accounts, right? I mean, this is the same Olaf Scholz that essentially allowed Nord Stream to be destroyed without a word. So he's saying that Ukraine won't join NATO anytime soon, and he explained that Kiev doesn't meet some of the criteria for membership in the US-led bloc. So here you have Olaf Scholz kind of putting on his big boy pants and saying, hey, look, Ukraine's not going to join NATO anytime soon, but this comes on the heels of dozens upon dozens of conversations privately, and then the media reports afterward and publicly, both privately and publicly, meetings and reports and all this to the media, saying Ukraine probably will be in NATO eventually, maybe sooner than later, maybe later than sooner, right? It's confusing, but here Schultz is saying, no, not in the foreseeable future. It's not going to be able to. Why? Because it doesn't meet a number of requirements, he says. So there's a lot of requirements, huh? They just opened an office in Japan, and suddenly there's a lot of requirements to join NATO. Again, I think this is the diplomatic and political fallout of Ukraine's dwindling chances on the battlefield. Earlier this month, the head of the U.S.-led military bloc, Jens Stoltenberg, declared that all member states had agreed to welcome Kiev, but only if and when it vanquished Moscow's forces. I mean, that's quite the ask, gotta say, Mr. Stoltenberg. So, in an interview with Die Welt, Germany's media, published on Monday, Schultz assessed that for the time being, Ukraine's Western backers should focus on helping the country defend its land. In the future, security guarantees for Kiev will need to be discussed as well. But we're a long way from there. What does that mean? Well, we're a long way to victory, because victory ain't coming. And I think that's what he really means. I'll never say it like that. When asked whether he would theoretically support Ukraine's accession to NATO after its military conflict with Russia was over, the chancellor claimed that it was, quote unquote, clear to everyone that this doesn't stand on the agenda anytime soon. One of the reasons for that, according to Schultz, is that, quote, there are a whole range of requirements belonging to NATO's criteria that Ukraine can't fulfill at present, end quote. Earlier this month, DPA news agency, citing a YouGov poll, reported that some 54% of Germans oppose the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, with only 27% in favor. So perhaps some of those considerations are the fact that your own people in Germany don't want to see it. That could be one of the considerations. NATO already has been losing legitimacy over the years and is becoming a less and less popular institution all across Europe, not least because the budgets of the defense budgets of these countries continue to grow. Austerity continues to grow as well, poverty as well. And, people start connecting the dots, and that's why you see protests in the Czech Republic and other places saying down with NATO. And it's because NATO is literally starving these countries of needed resources for people's needs. Meanwhile, also this month, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg told the Washington Post that all NATO allies agree that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. See, there you go. But he refused to offer any timeline for this. So there you have the conflicting narrative. Jens Stoltenberg says, yeah, Ukraine will be in NATO at some point. And then you have Olaf Scholz saying, well, does it even meet the criteria? What are those criteria? Well, I don't know. Like this is all about kind of hedging and trying to play off the reality of the situation, right? The reality is that Ukraine is not going to eject Russian forces because Ukraine is in a war of attrition it cannot win. So, according to the official, the U.S.-led military bloc is currently helping Kiev transition from Soviet-era equipment, doctrines, and standards and become interoperable with NATO forces. In April, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that most Europeans would disapprove if NATO did not extend well-deserved invitation into the alliance. The Ukrainian leadership made it clear it expected to see progress on the issue during its upcoming NATO summit in Lithuania in July. So that's BS, all right? So that's just one aspect of the diplomatic follow-up, but it's BS to say. It's absolutely wrong. That's absolutely wrong. There is no relationship. There is no relationship. I will repeat that. None between Ukraine's military capabilities and its so-called interoperability with NATO. That's not the reason. Because Estonia, Latvia, none of these post-Soviet countries, Lithuania, none of them were interoperable with NATO when they gained accession. None of them. They were all post-Soviet states. They all are transferring Soviet equipment to Ukraine. It's BS. So the real point here is that the fallout from Bakhmut, the fallout from Ukraine's military situation is that, well, now there's going to be less enthusiasm from the collective West of where things will go. And that's why you have Biden talking about things like freezing the conflict. But then there's the prospect for peace. Okay. So, in times like when Bakhmut falls, right, Artyomovsk, saying it correctly finally, or at least somewhat correctly, it is true, right, that battlefield victories should lead to possible openings for peace, right? You would think that the closer that Russia gets to victory, that perhaps there will be more engagement from all sides. And Russia's already said they're opposed to freezing the conflict. No surprise there, because guess when the conflict was also frozen? Well, it was also frozen during the Minsk Accords 7-8 years ago, right? When the collective West, a couple of their countries, decided to mediate with, of course, the U.S. closely watching and influencing the process between Ukraine and Russia. And what did Ukraine do? Continuously violated. What did the collective West do? Continue to egg it on. What did the United States do? Continue to fund, arm, and support the proxy forces, including many fascists, in order to just lay waste to the Donbass, lay waste to the Russians living there, lay waste to the people. And so Russia's not going to do that again. There's not going to be some kind of ceasefire that Russia is going to agree to that aligns or matches up with what the Minsk Accords were. So no frozen conflict for Russia. But Russia has always said that it is willing to negotiate for peace when their conditions are ripe for it. And they were ripe in April of 2022 in the United States and the United Kingdom decided to nix the deal. And of course, nudged Ukraine in nixing the deal as well. And now you have Vladimir Zelensky traveling around the world. We don't know where he is at any given moment, right? We don't know where he is at any given moment. But he's been in a lot of places. He's been in Saudi Arabia. He's been in Europe. He's now he just got done with the G7 summit. And at the G7 summit, Lula da Silva was also there, the president of Brazil. And the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, has offered a peace club option. He has said that he is willing to be one of the mediators of peace in Ukraine, and he wants to negotiate with all sides. He literally went to the G7 summit to meet with Zelensky to discuss the possibility of peace negotiations. Timing was very ripe because Bakhmut was about to fall, and the G7 is kind of this opportunity where you have all of these pro-Ukraine war, all of these countries, right, pledging support for more military assistance. It was a great opportunity for Lula to look like the standout and say, hey, I was allowed to attend this thing, and I chose to attend this thing. I'm going to try to use this time wisely. Zelensky, what did he do? He stood him up in the same venue. So this is how, when Russia says the conditions are no longer ripe for peace, this is what Russia means. It means that there is not a diplomatic solution when there isn't anyone to conduct diplomacy with. You can't do it with the United States and NATO, who says, oh no, the only peace plan that's relevant is if Ukraine takes back all the territory and ejects Russian forces. Does that sound like diplomacy? And then you have behavior like this. It's absolutely deplorable behavior. So Brazil's president claims, this is the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Brazil's president claims Zelensky stood him up at the G7 summit in a he said tit for tat, making his role as peacemaker more elusive. And so, of course, this is taking a little bit of a so-called neutral stance, saying claims, but this is what happened. Brazil's president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva had an eventful few days last weekend at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan, with one clear takeaway. Relations between Brazil and Ukraine are colder now than they were last week. Indeed, one might even conclude that the Brazilian president is now giving up on the prospect of contributing to a formal peace between Russia and Ukraine. Since before taking office in January, Lula has insisted that both Russia and Ukraine should stop fighting and begin discussing peace terms. He has argued for convening a small group of countries, including Brazil, Latin America's largest nation and the world's fourth largest democracy, with no direct involvement in the conflict to mediate negotiations. This position has been criticized widely, of course, right? There's been a lot of criticism that, oh, this is equivocation. You're equivocating between Ukraine and Russia and all this nonsense. But some have been saying that it's naive, and so that's what they're going over. You have Lula's former foreign minister and closest advisor who visited Ukraine earlier this month after having previously traveled to Russia. Ukraine's deputy minister of foreign affairs tweeted, "We are slowly changing the mood between Ukraine and Brazil," in a wink emoji signaling confidence or irony. Brazil hasn't appeared to change its position in the days after that trip. The Ukrainians invited Lula to visit, but he's yet to accept the offer, and there's been very little reported communication between Brazilian and Ukrainian officials. This is why President Vladimir Zelensky's sudden arrival at the G7 on Saturday, a visit decided in haste and kept secret until the last moment, according to Le Monde, was such an intriguing diplomatic development. Would he finally sit down with Lula? Right? So this is really interesting. So Zelensky went unannounced. There was no public announcement that he would go, but Lula came to the G7 summit, and so did Zelensky. So ultimately, they did not meet. Zelensky entered the room where heads of state were gathered on Sunday. Footage shows several leaders approaching to greet him. Lula's eyes fixed on a piece of paper in his hand, did not get up. Many on social media and beyond interpreted this as a slight, but it is not out of character for Lula. During a visit to the this is not important, but Lula remained seated while others stood at George W. Bush entered the room. Nobody got up when I walked in, said Lula, so I wouldn't stand for anyone else. Zelensky would go on to hold private meetings with most of the assembled heads of state. He apparently got no firm response from the Brazilians for hours. Finally, Lula scheduled a talk Sunday at 3:15 p.m., but when the time came, he claims Zelensky stood him up. When asked afterward if he was disappointed that he didn't meet with Lula, Zelensky replied tersely, a wry smirk crossing his face, "I think he was disappointed." So that's all you need to know about Zelensky. That's all you need to know. They're trying to frame it as, oh, well, Lula was dragging his feet in all of this to make it look like Zelensky has an excuse to do this. But this is ridiculous, right? Lula insisted that his team had set the meeting, but was told that at the agreed upon time that Zelensky would be late. Then he met with the Vietnamese president for an hour, during which he said the Ukrainian president never showed. That's what happened. That is, if I had a more serious problem, a more important meeting, I don't know. So this is what Lula said. Look, he concluded, Zelensky is overage. He knows what he's doing. So that's how Zelensky behaves. This is the fallout. This is what happens when you have a puppet who's in a situation where he's literally traveling around the world, avoiding Ukraine for really good reason. I think he's concerned about the battlefield situation, and if he goes back, that there will be trouble. That's my opinion. That's what I think. I think Zelensky is truly afraid of his position and status. I think that there has already been a lot of musical chairs in the Ukrainian government over the last several months. Who's to say that Zelensky won't be part of that game? That what makes his position so solid, given Ukraine's military situation, isn't really that great right now. Zelensky is not an impressive leader. Zelensky often talks out of turn. Zelensky is not someone who you can rely upon. He is not someone who you can trust. And the collective West knows this, and the United States knows this. And now he has shown it at the G7. He showed it. Not only did he show it at the Arab League summit when he was lecturing Arab countries saying, you don't know what colonialism is. You need to understand that Russia is an aggressor and that you need to stop supporting Russia. And I don't really care what your position on the war is. He was in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, in a room of Arab leaders talking like that. Then he goes to the G7 and stands up Lula da Silva and smiles to the media, saying, oh, I think he was the one that was disappointed. This is high school kind of games. This is adolescent behavior. But this behavior is part of his recklessness. It's what happens when you turn a puppet into one of the most important leaders in your neocon project. He is not a leader. He's a follower, but he has been empowered to lead a suicidal, reckless project of warmongering against Russia, which is backfiring mightily. So all of this is to say is that this is what you can expect more of. You can expect more of this bravado, more of this narrative management, and more of this political fallout. We're going to see the collective West heads continue to spin. We're going to see the United States wonder, well, how do we come out of this in a favorable position, knowing that if we just send all of our artillery and ammunition and fighter jets and all of that out into the battlefield and Russia shoots it down, what else do we have left? The United States, for all of its hubris, no matter how much it wants a hot war with Russia, it knows it can't win that. It knows that that would immediately cause such cataclysmic, just out of control chaos in the world order. It knows it can't do that, but it also knows it can't go on the way it's going on. And that's the problem here. So NATO this, NATO that, Zelensky having this like adolescent kind of behavior and amateurish behavior, avoiding Kiev, not going back to Ukraine, all of this. We're going to see more of this kind of desperation as they talk more about, as the neocons talk more about how do we get a permanent conflict that's essentially frozen so that we can re-up, restore, replenish over the course of years. So this is the long game. This is a long war. The United States and the collective West know they can't take care of Russia in one fell swoop. And so we better be prepared for that long war and treat it like a war, because that's the trouble with proxy wars, is oftentimes when the heat gets turned down, the volume gets turned down, then the attention span begins to waver and we begin to move on to other things. Well, this is going to be happening for quite some time, Every. So buckle your seatbelts. Okay, this is going to happen for quite some time. We're going to see for quite some time this kind of maneuvering, and I think it's going to look more and more pathetic over the course of the years, because if there's one undying, undeniable fact of history right now, is that the United States, NATO, the collective West, they're all becoming history. And that's what is really important here, is that they're becoming history. Their status economically, politically, militarily is waning. They are losing legitimacy, not just domestically, but especially internationally. It is accelerating internationally well beyond anything that we could have predicted before this conflict. And so prepare yourselves for this roller coaster ride that they are going to take humanity on, because it could very well lead to the unthinkable. And that's the danger here. That is the big danger here, is that the collective West is on a suicide mission and it's trying to take us all down with it.